At the end of the video that I made where I compared the 24-70 lenses from Canon and Sony mounted on the Sony a7R III body with Canon lens using metabones 5 adapter, I mentioned that from an image quality standpoint it didn't seem like I could see much difference, but from a usability standpoint there was a big difference. And one of the things that I mentioned is I noticed that there, with the Canon lens, there was a significant amount of lag between when you press the shutter button and when the picture was actually taken. And I wanted to investigate that a little bit more. So I ended up taking one of my lav mics, which is clipped on my shirt right now, and I set that on the camera body right next to the shutter button, and recorded audio while I pressed the shutter button, and the audio picked up the shutter button coming down and also the shutter firing. And I was able to use those audio files to measure how much camera lag I ended up with. So let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. Here is an audio file that I put together in Audacity that shows 4 audio clips from each of the test cases that I did. This first audio clip on the left is the Canon lens with the electronic front curtain shutter turned on, which is the way that I normally shoot. EFS is on. Then I switched to the Sony lens, and this also has the EFS on. Then, just to see what the difference might be, I turned the electronic front curtain shutter off, and this is the Canon lens with EFCS off, and this is the Sony lens with EFCS off. And let's take a listen to what those sound clips sound like when they're played. So we're going to start again with the Canon with the electronic front curtain shutter on, and the Sony with it on. Now let me point out some things that are going on with this waveform. I'm going to zoom in on here. So if we look at this wave, this first peak is where I press down the shutter button, and this is the sound of the camera shutter moving. So you can see that on this waveform, here's the camera press, or the shutter press, here's the shutter click. And if we look at the waveform for the Sony lens, you see the same features. So you see here's the shutter being pressed, and here's when it actually fires. And the time between when you press and when it fires is much, much shorter. So you can compare a couple of clicks from the Canon to the Sony. And because it's interesting, what I did, if I look down here, I'm going to unmute this so that you can see it. So if I zoom in on this waveform, this is what the waveform looks like with the Sony lens. This is where the electronic front curtain shutter is turned on. This is when it's turned off. And you can see that there are similar waveform features. So when it was turned off, you got this sort of 1, 2, 3, and then a double pulse. You get the same thing down here. You get 1, 2, 3, and a double pulse. But you get this stuff happening at the beginning where the front curtain is not being electrically I want to say it's not actuated, but here this is done. The front curtain is done electronically. On this one, the front curtain is done mechanically. So it adds time between when you press the shutter and when the shutter actually fires. So in these two cases, I took this waveform right here as being when the beginning of the shutter firing sequence was happening. And I'll explain why that's interesting in just a second. I'm going to mute this again. We're going to zoom back out here, and now we're going to listen to what it sounds like when the electronic front curtain shutter is disabled, so it's being done mechanically. And again, if we zoom in and take a look at the waveform between the Canon and the Sony, we can see that there's a big delay between here and this peak on the Canon and here and this peak on the Sony. So what I did was I used the Audacity software to measure the time between the shutter firing or when the button was pressed and when the shutter actually fired. And to decide where to measure to, I took this first peak as the, so I said there was 1, 2, 3, and then a double. I took the first peak as the place where I measured to. So you can, with your cursor, you can drag from here to here, and put this right on that first click. And down here, if you select this length button, it will tell you the length in milliseconds of this selected clip. So this first one is 264 milliseconds. So what I did was I recorded all of those times, and I summarized that here. So what I did was recorded them for each of the 4 button clicks, the button presses, and then took an average. And we'll see that with the Canon, the average was 260. With the Sony, it was only 86. And that's a significant difference. This is a quarter of a second between when you press the button and when the shutter fires. This is only a tenth of a second. And it seems like an eternity when you're going for dance moves. What you end up doing is, after some practice, you end up anticipating when the beat is that you're going to be wanting to take the picture on, and you can anticipate that just a little bit. Now with the electronic front curtain off, this goes up to almost a third of a second shutter lag with the Canon, and then with the Sony, the shutter lag is only about half of that. But there's a significantly more shutter lag between the Canon with electronic front curtain shutter off and on, or on and off, I should say. So going to mechanical front curtain shutter adds somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 milliseconds, and it appears to be just about 70 milliseconds with the Sony. So my conclusion here is that if you can get away with it, you want to use the Sony lens with electronic front curtain shutter on, if that does not cause you banding problems. So back to the question of which lens is better for what I do, and that's dance photography. Without a doubt, for me, the Sony lens is better with the Canon. Even if the image quality is the same, the fact that the shutter lag on the Canon with the metabones adapter is so much higher than the Sony, it makes a huge difference in whether or not I get my shots. So that's one reason I'm very glad that I ended up going with the Sony lens. That's it for now.